We'll get going. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from in the world. My name is Matthew Tsembruggencate. I'm a communication officer with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which is home to Earth Negotiations Bulletin. We are an independent, neutral reporting service that has been covering environmental negotiations and sustainable development negotiations since 1992, since the Rio Earth Summit. So this is our 30th year of reporting, and we are here in Montreal at the Convention on Biological Diversity's COP15. So thank you very much for joining this halfway point webinar. I'm going to give just a little bit of housekeeping, and then I will turn things over to Dr. Elsa Tsioumani, who is team leading for us here in Montreal. So there will be a Q&A, it's still early here, a Q&A portion for the back half of this, the last 30 minutes. So please, if you have a question, you're welcome to share it in the chat, but it's much easier for us to organize things if you use the Q&A function that is within Zoom. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there'll be a little Q&A, and you can go there to add a question or to upvote if you want. If you see somebody else has put in a great question, use that. The usual caveat that we give with these webinars is that we have a very broad audience. We've got quite a few people joining us with different levels of expertise. So if some of the points we make are quite general about the global biodiversity framework or the negotiations going on, and you're really looking for getting into the weeds, don't worry, hang with us, especially when we get to the Q&A. We will get into the nitty-gritty details. In the meantime, I will turn it over to Dr. Elsa Tsioumani with the question of just to remind us all, what is the main goal of these negotiations today? Elsa.
Thank you, Matt. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So just to acknowledge the team members that have been working very hard at this conference, Wanda Nigi and Nicole Sabius, Kaspar Solberger, Elsa Tsioumani, who's been writing and working hard from the working groups of the UN Biodiversity Conference, as well as the working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework held immediately prior to the UN Biodiversity Conference, and Mike Mouzurakis, our photographer and digital editor. The photos are available on the website. You can see them and use them with attribution. So we are here in Montreal, the long-awaited UN Biodiversity Conference, delayed for 2 years because of the global pandemic. And the main aim, as most of you know, is to reverse the current rate of biodiversity loss. There has been lots of work towards that objective. The Aichi targets, as again most of you know, have not been very successful in their implementation. That was the Aichi targets were a set of global targets to reverse biodiversity loss under the strategic plan for biodiversity that, let's say, expired in 2010. And a working group under the Convention on Biological Diversity has been working for the last years to develop a new global biodiversity framework, again, with the aim to, the main aim, the overall aim to reverse biodiversity loss. The working group has had 5 meetings. The 5th one was held immediately prior to the UN Biodiversity Conference just last week. And it actually had a very limited progress in finalizing the text, which if you had the chance to see, has many outstanding issues around all the general sections, the goals, and the targets of the framework. The pace changed somewhat with the beginning of the Conference of the Parties. So the UN Biodiversity Conference, we must know that it has, technically speaking, it has 3 parts. The Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the meeting of the parties to the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, and then the meeting of the parties to the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. So the pace changed, as I was saying. Delegates started making progress on the global biodiversity framework, as well as on other items of the agenda, which is long and very varied. We had a stock-taking plenary yesterday to review progress, and it actually adopted several decisions on the most technical matters, which are the less controversial ones. It was acknowledged that the working groups are close to finalizing the work. At the same time, multiple contact groups, friends of the chair groups, and other informal groups have been working on the more controversial items, including like the global biodiversity framework, marine and coastal biodiversity, monitoring, reporting, and review, like to mention just a few. And now just to outline what are the main issues, the main agenda items that need to be agreed for this conference to be considered a success. So first of all, it's a global biodiversity framework. It's a long document which includes general sections, goals to be achieved by 2050, and a set of targets to be achieved by 2030. Deliberations continue under a contact group. Some issues have been resolved, but the text still remains largely in brackets, with several issues to be resolved within each section, each goal, and each target. Then the other big issue to be resolved is concerns resource mobilization. As many of you probably know, resource mobilization is being promoted strongly by developing countries who host most of the world's biodiversity, and maintain that unless they get funding and means of implementation, any global biodiversity framework that will be agreed upon cannot be implemented. So on resource mobilization, discussions revolve around whether there will be a numerical target, like a number of like a specific amount of funds to be included in a target to support implementation of the global biodiversity framework. The African group also and other developing countries strongly promote the creation of a global biodiversity fund to support implementation of the global biodiversity framework. Then other developing countries talk about possibly reforming the activities of the Global Environment Facility to support a biodiversity-related action. So, I mean, we have two parts of the package already: the Global Biodiversity Framework and the resource mobilization. Then the other big issue is digital sequence information. Developing countries argue that in order to have an agreement on the global biodiversity framework and for it to be effective, we need to have agreement on benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information. And when we talk about digital sequence information, we refer to the information content of the genetic resources that on the basis of developments in science and technology can be used for bio-based research and development processes. DSI has been the most controversial issue, like digital sequence formation, like DSI is the acronym, has been the most controversial issue the last couple of years, not only under the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also in similar processes dealing with access to genetic resources and benefit sharing under the World Health Organization, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, and the UN negotiations on marine biodiversity beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. It is going unexpectedly well. the discussions on digital security information in the UN Biodiversity Conference. However, it is still too early to say whether they will be successful or not. Particularly since discussions are mostly being held in a Friends of the Chair group to which we don't have access. So three items already: GBF, resource mobilization, and DSI, and the fourth one is monitoring, reporting, and review. It is mostly the preference of developed countries to agree on some kind of a global mechanism to review implementation of any global biodiversity framework that is to be agreed to promote its and enhance its implementation. Discussions are still ongoing on this item, but there is some agreement already to establish a global review mechanism with details still to be developed. So 4 items, main items for the package. And then there are a number of cross-cutting items that need to be addressed across all agenda items and in each and every target of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And these concern the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, and whether the framework will be based on a rights-based approach and how strong that would be. This was delegates were reminded of this yesterday on the occasion of the International Human Rights Day. Then there is the question of marine and coastal biodiversity, which several participants think that it does not get the attention it deserves under the global framework and beyond. Then it's the question of synthetic biology and of emerging technologies more generally, that it's very controversial. These issues have been traditionally controversial in the CBD framework and the protocols. And there was some agreement last week under the item of synthetic biology to conduct regular horizon scanning of the scientific and technological developments, but the item cuts across all other issues concerning scientific and technical cooperation, funding, etc. So we have had some early successes, particularly with the adoption of a long series of technical decisions yesterday, the stock-taking plenary. However, most of these big issues that I mentioned are still outstanding. The work continues very intensely, like delegates work like day and night. And yes, that's it, more or less. It is still too early to assess whether the meeting will be successful or not. And what exactly we mean by successful is also a question for consideration. And but yes, also just to recall that not everything is related to the Global Biodiversity Framework. The convention work goes beyond that. But at this stage, yes, so the GBF is what everybody looks at. Thank you.
Thank you, Elsa. We're going so please, if you have a question, drop it in the Q&A. I guess I want to start with my own question. What's the mood? What is the mood with negotiators right now as they work through this? And certainly coming in, there were wide gaps. So what's your perception of the overall tone of discussions, whether or not there's, even with some of the technical progress that you've noted just in the past few days, is that building momentum, do you feel? What's your perception of the mood of delegates?
to tell you the truth, I think that everybody's very tired. At least yesterday, everybody was very tired, and you could see it, you could feel it in the negotiations. But I think momentum is building, and I think that most of the people do acknowledge the successes, and let's say they see the end, the light at the end of the tunnel. However, the work that remains to be done is indeed overwhelming. So, yeah, I think many people are frightened exactly because of the mere amount of work to be done, not only the political compromises that need to be achieved on the main issues, but also the amount of technical work to be done.
Thank you. I think a number of people might also be tired. I don't know what the overlap is between climate negotiators and biodiversity negotiators, but we're coming off what was a very intense session in Sharm el-Sheikh on climate just a couple of weeks ago.
Indeed.
I think a lot of people are looking forward to perhaps the holidays.
Indeed.
A good question. How have biodiversity credits and offsets been coming into these negotiations? How has that issue been rearing its head in the official talks? I know in some of the side event rooms, this is a topic. How is it popping up in the actual negotiations?
It, as far as I know, it hasn't yet. I mean, it could pop up under a number of targets of the global biodiversity framework and some other issues, but for the time being, yeah, again, as far as I know, it hasn't. And this is indeed a very controversial item for the CBD, and many people directly oppose to any idea of biodiversity offsets. So, yeah.
Yeah, can you give perhaps a bit of background of that? Like net zero is the idea in climate that you can buy offsets and this will balance out the carbon emissions that happen. But this idea of balancing out things has not really appeared in the biodiversity realm, in the biodiversity sphere before. Is that correct?
Yes. I think the idea emerges mainly in the climate negotiations, but yeah, there are several problems that are being acknowledged in the CBD. The fact that biodiversity cannot be simply an afterthought to climate change considerations. There are lots of challenges with regard to the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities when it comes to that. And see that, a lot of promises can be made with regard to offsets, but they are very hard to be implemented, basically because the amount of land that we have is just limited, and needs to satisfy a number of needs, including, for instance, food production and others. So, using land only or mainly to offset climate is problematic.
Sure. A lot of questions about this that I think reflect how Canada has been using its voice in the negotiations. Are we likely to see a final resolution and commitments to the 30 by 30 target? And perhaps if you want to give just a quick definition of what that is.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in the opening ceremony announced, placed an amount of 350 million, I think, for biodiversity conservation in developing countries, plus additional funding for indigenous-led conservation projects in Canada, which was very well received. Yes, the 30 by 30 target, we talk about many people support it. And the question is whether the international community will agree to protect 30% of the lands and waters by 2030. It's considered to be a very strong conservation target. There are issues to be resolved, particularly regarding who will have control over those protected areas, to say it in general terms, particularly because many of the biodiversity hotspots are currently in developing countries and in traditional lands of indigenous peoples. And also there are questions of how the quality, let's say, of biodiversity richness is in these areas is going to be assessed, because of course when we talk about protected areas, there need to be some rich biodiversity value. And then of course there is the question of implementation, who is going to assess whether the target is being implemented or not successfully. But yeah, it's quite controversial because of all these issues, exactly, and also the main issue of who is going to provide the resources for implementation of this target. It's it's one of the most controversial targets, and there haven't been intense discussions on it yet.
A question from the chat, and just a reminder, I encourage you to use the Q&A function just for organizational purposes. If possible, could you please expand on what sticking points there are around target 3?
Yeah, I mean, I just said them more or less. They refer to safeguards for indigenous peoples and local communities. Then some countries object also to the percentage. So the percentage is again under consideration. The relationship with the means of implementation. So who has and who is going to provide the capacity and the funding for implementation of this target. Also, yeah, these are the main issues.
Jumping off that and addressing one of the questions, how likely do you think there will be a strong human rights and indigenous rights embedded into the global biodiversity framework and reflected in the final COP15 decision?
This has been promoted very strongly by certain countries, as well as by the civil society and indigenous peoples organizations. Traditionally, parties to the CBD have shied away from including strong human rights related language in the decisions. Now the voices are louder on the need to include such an approach, and also the landscape, the international landscape seems to be changing with the adoption of the UN General Assembly resolution to a right on a clean, safe and sustainable environment. So I would say there may be more chances, although many governments insist that it's a matter of mandate, of a different mandate between different conventions, and that's why they do not promote adoption of a human rights language in the CBD.
I don't know if it would be possible to answer this question, so perhaps we can give some general thoughts of how many indigenous peoples groups are represented here in the negotiations.
Yeah, I don't know exactly. There are many. They are under the umbrella of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. I don't know if all of them accept to be under this umbrella, but this is the one that has been talking in the negotiations. I have been.
Can you give any thoughts as an observer how you think the Chinese delegation have been using their presidency to kind of shape talks to help some issues make progress? And just a reminder that this conference is taking place in Canada, but the host is China. And in fact, these negotiations were supposed to be taking place in Kunming and moved because of the COVID restrictions.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems that Canada and China have been sharing, let's say, the presidency and the hosting of this conference. We haven't really witnessed yet, or at least those of us that follow the public parts of the publicly available parts of the conference, haven't witnessed the initiatives of the Chinese presidency. The Minister of Environment, who's been chairing the conference and the plenary, seems to be quite passionate about it, but I mean, that's all we've seen. I mean, I would expect that the Chinese will be more active during the second part of the conference when the ministers arrive and when the negotiations will move beyond closed doors more. At this stage, at least we haven't witnessed some major initiatives of the Chinese presidency.
We've got a few questions asking about what specific agreements have been signed, what specific parts have had their text all cleaned and have been agreed to. I don't know. I don't expect you to be able to list them all off the top of your head, but perhaps if there are a few notable ones, and then we'll look to make a list and share it in the email that will go out with the recording of this. I know going into the stock taking plenary, we shared an Excel spreadsheet that had a list of which ones were not cleaned, which ones had their brackets lifted. So I'm sure we'll be updating that in our report.
We will update that one. Also in yesterday's bulletin, we listed all the decisions that were adopted. There were many decisions under the two protocols of the convention. So mainly under the Cartagena protocol, for instance, on compliance, on monitoring and reporting, risk assessment and risk management of living modified organisms, assessment and review of processes, and under the Nagoya protocol, again on compliance, capacity building and awareness raising, monitoring, reporting and review of effectiveness. And under the convention, the main decisions adopted concerned Article 8J on traditional knowledge, but it's mostly technical decisions concerning the future of work under Article 8J under the convention, and the development of a new program of work on Article 8J, as well as a couple of decisions on sustainable wildlife management and the scientific and technical evidence for the global biodiversity framework. So yes, it's mostly technical decisions, but again, they signify some form of progress, at least for cleaning up the agenda and leaving time available for the most controversial items.
A question, is the concept of ecosystem-based climate solutions for adaptation, sometimes called nature-based solutions, getting a lot of attention in the convention, and particularly in the negotiations that you're following? And are there any disagreements around it?
Yeah, it's nature-based. The term nature-based solutions has been promoted a lot the last couple of years. It's not a term used under the convention. It has been included now in the global biodiversity framework and a couple of other decisions in brackets. However, it's not agreed upon, and usually it's mentioned alongside ecosystem-based approaches. So it's like nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches, which the definitions. I mean, there has been a definition of nature-based solutions at the last UN Environment Assembly meeting. We'll see how this issue will develop under the convention. For the time being, yes, it's mentioned alongside ecosystem-based approaches.
I wonder, as a lead into a question that we've got, sometimes at ENB, we say nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Can you explain what we mean when we use that phrase? Okay, yes. So, I mean, under international law and under the Convention on Biological Diversity in particular, all decisions are taken by consensus in plenary. So
this quote means that any party can basically oppose any part of the decision, even at the last moment, like right in the closing plenary. However, I mean, it could be argued that this is against the principle of good faith. So if delegates have been arguing quite intensely for long hours in working groups and contact groups to reach some kind of agreement, then reopening the agreed text at the very last moment, is considered, could be considered bad faith. It is still the prerogative of parties to do it, but it's not well received because it depends. I mean, who is doing it? If it's one party or it's like several parties, on exactly the circumstances of this approach. But generally speaking, particularly when delegates negotiate lengthy and complex texts, the co-chairs ask parties to refrain from adding text or reopening already agreed text, just to allow progress in the negotiations.
So that leads into a question from Helen Briggs. If we get to the 19th and it drags into the 20th, and if it was like a climate negotiation, yeah, I know. If it drags, as we have seen some of the more recent climate COPs, if it really goes on several days, what happens if they can't agree to anything in this time frame? What are the possibilities?
I mean, you know, if they can't agree, they won't agree. There will be some outcomes, but not other outcomes. If there isn't a global biodiversity, a new global biodiversity framework, I mean, okay, then we can discuss what it means for the future of global biodiversity governance. But like, to be an optimist, I would argue that, I mean, we haven't implemented the H targets, so governments who want to actually work towards biodiversity conservation can work on the H targets. I mean, I would say, I mean, yeah, there can be other ways around it. I mean, it would probably signify some political failure and like a loss of momentum. Yeah, like I don't know how people would frame it, but like for biodiversity action on the ground, I don't think it would be a total disaster. I mean, for the high level, for the high political level, it could be more problematic.
We were talking before we started the webinar about how much of the DSI negotiations are going on behind closed doors. So I don't know how much of an answer you'll be able to give for this, but I'll ask it anyways. Can you give us an update on progress being made on agreement on DSI? What are the outstanding problems that might be remaining on this topic?
Okay, yes, I mean, I will try. So the last time we managed to follow discussions on DSI in a contact group that was still open to observers, there was a non-paper from the delegates, a non-paper presented from the co-chairs of that group that listed possible options, let's say, for future work on DSI. There seemed to be like some common ground finally towards building, establishing a multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing from DSI use. With some countries also want to have to include in the solution, they talk about it as a hybrid solution. So they want to include some bilateral elements to allow for consideration of national access and benefit sharing legislation when this, because many countries have already adopted legislation that that requires benefit sharing from use of DSI. So they want these national legislations to be somehow included in the multilateral framework. yeah, the thing is that there are certain, a limited number of parties that still say that DSI is not covered by the scope of the convention and the Nagoya Protocol, so it should not, the CBD should not deal with it at all. They haven't, these parties haven't obstructed the negotiations or a possible solution up to now, but we don't know how this will develop, whether these parties will veto consensus at a later stage of the negotiations when we are closer to a potential agreement. I mean, the way I understood it, again, when I last followed the negotiations, they were working, delegates were working towards establishing a multilateral mechanism, including a process for funding this multilateral mechanism, as well as including integrating a certain number of bilateral solutions. It's complicated. I don't know if this was clear, but yeah, if you want, I can provide more details at some point.
And just to share, at least one person I saw in the chat wants to say that they too are an optimist. So thank you for taking that perspective. A question I also saw in the chat, is it possible to expand on Africa's position about the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund and the response from developed countries? That's something you can share about.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. Is it possible to expand on Africa's position about the GBF fund and what has been the response from developed countries?
Yeah, Africa's position, which was shared yesterday at the stock-taking plenary from a number of other developing countries from Latin America and Asia, was to establish a global biodiversity fund to support the implementation of the GBF with, I mean, they want also a specific numerical value, a specific amount, a target to be achieved. I mean, developed countries oppose it. The arguments are that the Global Environment Facility is the financial mechanism of the convention, that we don't need another fund. And also, of course, the question of funding is always a matter of controversy, because developed countries are supposed to provide funding. Also, it's like an obligation under the Articles 20 and 21 of the Convention, right? So this is why an argument of developing countries is that if we have a monitor and review mechanism, then this mechanism should monitor not only the conservation-related commitments, but also the funding-related commitments, which is again opposed from the developed countries. And yes, also developed countries note that pandemic, it's a difficult circumstance for everybody. How can we provide funding for biodiversity? I mean, these are all long-standing arguments, that have been made more difficult in the context of the global crisis.
Someone observed, thank you for this webinar and your support. They have a question, maybe you can expand on a bit for someone coming in. Why is knowledge management and planning, monitoring, reporting, and review so difficult? It seems so far the only topic to this person, it seems like the only topic which there is already talk about postponing a decision until COP16. You want to perhaps share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, monitoring, it is difficult because implementation compliance under the convention have always been a problematic area. As most of you probably know, there is no enforcement mechanism or compliance review mechanism under the convention. Its implementation of the convention is left with national governments. As a result, and also because of the complexity of the subject matter and of the varied agenda that the CBD covers, implementation outcomes have been mixed. Or it's also a matter of, for instance, in the international reports, developing countries mostly point out that they lack both capacity and funding to monitor the state of biodiversity and the state of implementation in their countries. So it has been put forward mainly by developed countries that a monitoring and review mechanism, a more systematized and a global mechanism, could promote implementation and compliance with the convention. This has been opposed by developing countries who argue that, on the other hand, as I just mentioned, funding and capacities are needed for implementation. And if it is to monitor implementation of conservation commitments, then we also need to monitor implementation of funding commitments. There is this generalized fear from the part of the developing countries that there is going to be a punitive compliance mechanism, which hasn't been the case in the international instruments adopted the last 2 decades, let's say, also under the Nagoya Protocol and the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. There are compliance mechanisms, but they are facilitative and cooperative, aiming to promote compliance that way. So yes, they did agree to have a global review, like as a compromise option for the time being, but it's for all these reasons that I just explained that the issue is difficult and yeah, maybe postponed to the next COP.
First of all, just to mention, somebody had asked about getting the documents for the CBD COP15, where they can find those. And if you scroll back up through the chat, I've dropped in the link where you can find the official documents that are coming out over the course of the talks. And we're trying to jump around to as many questions as possible. And thank you for such great questions. How has the issue of ecosystem representation been dealt with in the current text? And this Peter Wood puts in brackets, ensuring that new protection prioritizes underrepresented ecosystems instead of just protecting areas that weren't under threat. How is that popping up in the talks?
Yeah, we haven't been really touching upon such technical questions in the text. And I think the tendency is that the GBF goes for more generalized, let's say, text in an effort to reach consensus. So unfortunately, I'm not sure that underrepresented ecosystems will be in the text. I mean, I guess it's then up to organizations working with national governments to make sure that such underrepresented ecosystems have their place in the implementation of international commitments. But I may be wrong, this is still totally up for negotiations.
I'll go back to a question that I think, again, goes to the scale of optimism or pessimism around these talks. That Frederick Wolf observes, the big elements of the GBF are still heavily disputed. Many parties have come up with proposals that could lower ambition considerably, such as challenging footprint and planetary boundaries in Goal B. So how do you see the chances that the GBF may end up being watered down? And I mean, we talked about the Aichi targets. He points out in his question that the SDGs, I think there was ambition there, but all the reports that we've had, and certainly, you know, with the pandemic's influence, we're behind and off target on I think nearly all the SDGs and their elements. So what are your thoughts about the potential watering down of the GBF?
Yeah, I mean, I must admit it is big, the potential watering down, and it is, again, it is a tendency in the last decade at least, at, in international negotiations, in an effort to reach consensus to water down the text, particularly when we talk about target-based governance, like in the case of the GBF. It's yeah, I mean, it's supposed to be ambitious and inspirational, but yeah, it may be yeah, there is a good chance that in an effort to reach consensus, the text is severely watered down. Again, as I said, though, it is up to national governments to implement more ambitious, something more ambitious, right? More ambitious package. We have to keep in mind that these international agreements are usually the lowest common denominator on every little thing. So, I mean, I think we should treat them as the basis rather than the actual top of the target.
A really good question for EMB, and something that I know you wrote about recently. Can you comment on the extent of integration of the climate and biodiversity agendas? This person is particularly anticipating, looking forward to COP28. What are the institutions, possibly a lead institution, bridging the two agendas together? Can you give us a sense, especially because EMB, Earth Negotiations Bulletin, as a plug for our continued reporting, reports from the climate negotiations. I was just in Sharm el-Sheikh myself, but we also cover chemicals negotiations. We also report on the SDGs. We report across the gamut of environmental negotiations. So how do the climate and biodiversity agendas interact?
Yeah, this is another big area of consideration. I mean, traditionally, the CBD has dealt with climate change and the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, as well as the impacts of climate change policies on biodiversity, for instance, biofuels, etc. So it is not rare. It is it is not rare for the CBD to deal with issues like that. It is more difficult for the UNFCCC to deal with biodiversity-related topics, and I mean, these discussions have been recent. I think they started in Glasgow with the nature focus, and again in Sharm they had the biodiversity day. So yeah, it's rather to the UNFCCC COP to take biodiversity into consideration more than vice versa. I mean, yes, we did produce a series of studies with IASB on the interlinkages between biodiversity and climate change policies. And we argued that there are several mechanisms already in place, like institutional mechanisms under the CBD and under the UNFCCC to promote closer interaction between the two processes, and at the end, more successful implementation on the ground, right? More holistic implementation. There are also legal hooks in the text of the conventions. There are COP decisions to be taken into account. So all the legal and institutional framework is actually there to promote such interactions. It's more a matter of political will and let's say broadening the minds of those working either on climate change or on biodiversity to deal with both issues in a more unified fashion.
Elsa, you mentioned a series of thematic papers called Synergies Between Biodiversity and Climate Policy Framework. I've just put the link into the chat. I hope earning my keep again as a communication officer for IASD and for Earth Negotiations Bulletin. A question from someone who says they were very disappointed by the lack of civil society representation in Sharm el-Sheikh. What's your perspective on civil society participation here in Montreal?
mean, civil society is around. I mean, they are in the negotiations. They organize several side events and other kind of activities within the conference center. I mean, to my view, they do what they can. I don't know how much, I mean, of course, because this is not public knowledge, I don't know how much they work towards lobbying governments, let's say, towards approaching governments in a more bilateral way. But when it comes to the public initiatives, I mean, they're quite visible and quite active. I don't know how much more space they could possibly have in such kind of conferences when decision-making is strictly for governments, right? This must be clear. And I mean, they do talk in plenary meetings, they do participate in contact groups, but then again, when negotiations are held behind closed doors, they are not there. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how much more influential they could possibly be. I think it's, I would say the civil society's place is more before the actual conference takes place than during the actual conference.
I just want to compliment everyone who's sharing resources and their observations in the chat. I think that, we're getting tremendous benefit, Elsa, from what you're sharing, but thank you everyone who's sharing their thoughts and linking out to their resources and the work that you're doing as we head towards the end of the hour. Perhaps this will give just a bit of background for people who don't understand. The US is not an official representative at COP15. And there's a question, do you think that harms US credibility when dealing with these issues? But perhaps you could give a sense of how the US present, because they are present here, how is that working? How are they, from your perspective and your perception observing these talks, how do they influence the talks around the GBF?
Yes, so the US are not a party to the CBD. It's basically only the US and the Holy See that have not ratified the convention. There is, of course, a US delegation here participating as observers, speaking on some items as observers, and then, I mean, they do coordinate with other governments that share positions on certain agenda items. So, I mean, I'm sure their position is being taken into consideration. And yes, because they don't have a unique position on biodiversity-related matters. Other parties share the US positions too. Of course, it depends on agenda items, right? The coalitions in the CBD may change depending on the agenda item. Yeah, now, I mean, how much the lack of their official participation affects their political credibility, I guess this is a more general question, because the US hasn't ratified many international conventions beyond the CBD, so it's not a question for the CBD only. It's more a question for proper participation, let's say, in the international community through international law.
Someone asks two questions simultaneously, and just this might be a bit of clarification. If I understood you correctly, there's still no workable draft. Is that correct? And just for people to understand where they can follow the latest drafts of the GBF as it comes out. And then a question, do you expect the funding issues to be resolved before ministers arrive? Just to clarify for someone who's...
Yeah. So the draft of the working draft of the GBF and all the other agenda items, you can find them in the conference website under in-session documents, where you will see all the CRPs and non-papers under the plenary and its working group. So you can see it there. They've been updated regularly to reflect changes, and so this is quite good. And what was the other question? Sorry.
Whether you expect the funding issue is something that could be resolved before ministers really start weighing in.
Traditionally, the funding issue is the last one to be resolved, the very last one. So either it will be resolved together with the GBF, or after, or even after the GBF. Yeah.
So I've put again the link to those documents, the official documents coming from the CBD, into the chat if you want to grab that, and then do bookmark it, because as Elsa noted, it keeps getting updated. We're coming to the end of the hour, and truly my apologies that we can't handle every question, but it's really lovely to see such deep questions. And we always hope that the Earth Negotiations Bulletin is being useful for everyone. I guess, Elsa, I'll give you the chance to make any parting comments of what your expectations are for the upcoming week. What, well, week and a half, it goes until the 19th in theory. What are you going to be looking for to get a sense of the momentum, to reinforce the optimistic outlook that you're taking? What kind of actions are you hoping to see from the negotiators?
I mean, okay, we can dream and talk about like a strong and ambitious GBF together with like an ambitious resource mobilization package and a good decision on DSI. I mean, I do hope. I mean, the people do talk already that we'll be going. The conference will continue until the 20th, and we've been betting on what time we might finish, whether it's before noon or after noon in the 20th. Yeah, it's as I said in the beginning, it is still too early. Everything is, it's we have the texts are unresolved, so nobody can really say how this will end. Yeah, so I cannot be more certain about the future of next week.
Well, I think we've asked quite a lot of you over the course of this past hour, and prognosticating the future might be even a step too far for me. So truly, thank you, Dr. Tsioumani, for coming in on your day off early here in Montreal to take everyone's questions. I think it's deeply appreciated. A number of people in the chat have expressed their appreciation. And thank all of you for joining us with your questions and with your observations. I think we've learned a lot looking at the chat over the course of this. We will continue to report from CBD COP15, so please, if you haven't already, subscribe to the ENB update and follow us on socials, and please keep following this as we head into the second week of the UN Biodiversity Conference. And wherever you are in the world, please have a very wonderful day. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.